The letter was sitting on my front porch on a Monday morning, half buried under 2 inches of fresh snow, and it had that very particular shade of official cream-white paper that HOA correspondence always seems to come on, like they ordered it from some special supplier, specifically designed to make your stomach drop the moment you recognize it. I picked it up, brushed the snow off it, and stood there in my insulated work boots reading it while my breath made little clouds in the 22-degree air. It was from the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association, and it informed me, in no uncertain terms, that the large blue windbreak tarp I had installed along the north fence line of my property was in violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA's Architectural and Aesthetic Guidelines, and that I had 14 days to remove it or face fines of $150 per day until the violation was remedied. Signed at the bottom, in that particular kind of aggressive cursive that people only use when they want to remind you who has power, Joan Bishop, HOA Compliance Coordinator. I stood there for a full 30 seconds, just staring at the signature, and then I looked up at the sky. It was flat gray in every direction, the kind of sky that means business, and the weather app on my phone was already warning about a major winter system rolling in from the northwest that was expected to bring sustained temperatures as low as -12 with wind chill values that would make your skin hurt in under 10 minutes. The Farmer's Almanac, which I know a lot of people dismiss but which my father always swore by, had already called this winter as one of the worst in about a decade. My name is Aaron Reynolds, and I have lived in the Maplewood Ridge subdivision for 7 years. I am a reasonably patient man. I pay my HOA dues on time every month. I keep my lawn tidy in the summer. I shovel my driveway promptly after every snowfall, and I have never, in 7 years, caused a genuine complaint from any actual human being in this neighborhood. But I had bought that tarp and installed it last November because I had a very specific and practical reason for doing so, and that reason was that the north side of my property, where my utility connections run along the outside of my foundation, was completely exposed to the open field that backs up to our subdivision on the north side. The field creates a natural wind tunnel. Every cold front that comes roaring down from Canada funnels through that field and hits the north side of my house like a fire hose. 2 winters ago, before the tarp, I had a pipe crack in the wall where my outdoor water bib connects to my interior plumbing, and it cost me over $2,000 to repair. Last winter I had the tarp, and not a single issue. The tarp was not visible from the street. You had to walk around the side of my house or look through the thin strip of space between my property and my neighbor Dave's place to even see it. It was secured properly. It was not flapping in the wind, and it was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I had used bungee cords and stakes to hold it down tight against the fence, and the thing was honestly barely noticeable. But Joan Bishop had noticed it. Or rather, Joan Bishop had gone looking for something to notice, which was a very different thing. Joan had moved into Maplewood Ridge about 3 years ago, and in the first 6 months she had managed to appoint herself to 3 different HOA committees, elbow out the previous compliance coordinator, a perfectly reasonable retired teacher named Frank Gallo who enforced the rules with common sense and a let's talk about it attitude, and begin what she liked to describe as a comprehensive property standards review of the entire neighborhood. What this meant in practice was that Joan drove slowly around the subdivision in her silver Buick SUV about 3 times a week, looking for anything she could write someone up for. She had sent violation letters for a garden gnome she deemed too whimsical in scale, for a mailbox post that she claimed was painted 0.5 inches too narrow for the color specification guidelines, and for a welcome mat that she personally found offensive because it said "Go away" in a humorous font. The mat belonged to a retired Marine named Terry Cousins who had lived here 15 years and who had never once bothered a soul. The thing about Joan was not just that she was strict. Lots of people in HOA positions are strict, and if they are applying rules consistently and fairly, you can respect that even when you disagree. The thing about Joan was that she was selective. She found the people she did not like, and she ignored the exact same infractions for the people she did like. Dave Greer 2 streets over had a storage shed that was clearly over the size limit, but Joan had never sent him a letter. Her friend Patricia Malone had a basketball hoop in the driveway every single weekend, and it never got mentioned. The rules, for Joan, were not really about maintaining community standards. They were a weapon she used when she wanted leverage over someone, or when she simply decided she did not care for a particular person. She had decided she did not care for me about a year earlier, when I had attended an HOA board meeting and asked, very politely but very directly, why the HOA's reserve fund had decreased by nearly $18,000 in a single fiscal year, when none of the scheduled maintenance projects had actually been completed. Joan had been the one presenting the financial summary that evening, and she had not appreciated the question. She had answered it with some very vague language about administrative costs and professional consultation fees. And when I had pressed just a little bit, asking specifically which consultants had been paid and for what services, she had told me that detailed financial records were available upon written request, and had moved on so quickly she nearly gave herself whiplash. I had submitted that written request. 3 months later, I had not received a single document. So when I stood on my porch reading that violation letter in the January cold, I understood exactly what it was. It was Joan Bishop, reminding me that she had the power to make my life annoying and using it. She was not worried about my tarp. She was annoyed that I had asked questions about that reserve fund, and this was her way of poking me. The normal, sensible thing to do would have been to call Joan, explain that the tarp was a functional necessity given the layout of my property, and ask for a variance. The HOA did have a variance process. But the problem with that approach was that it would put me in the position of asking Joan for a favor, and Joan would use that to extract some kind of submission from me. She would make me wait, probably deny it the first time to string me out, and ultimately force me to either pay her fines or come back to her on my knees. I knew how this worked because I had watched her do it to my neighbor Linda Horton, who had gone through a 3-month variance request saga just to install a handicap-accessible ramp for her mother. And Joan had ultimately only approved it after making Linda attend 2 separate compliance meetings and write a formal letter of apology for installing the ramp before getting approval, even though Linda had genuinely not known she needed approval for a medical accessibility modification. I decided to try a different approach. I was going to comply, not because Joan was right, not because the tarp was actually a problem, but because I had done my research on the HOA rules thoroughly enough to know that simply removing the tarp would, ironically, hurt Joan far more than it hurt me. See, it was not just my tarp protecting my north fence line from that wind. The tarp ran along about 30 feet of fence, and directly on the other side of that fence was the shared HOA utility corridor, where the association maintained the main water shutoff valves and the supply lines that ran to the community irrigation system, and critically, to the 3 guest parking area utility hookups on that stretch. The HOA had installed those hookups a couple years back as part of a Welcome Winter Visitors initiative that Joan herself had championed as a great community amenity. They were heated pedestals for RV and trailer hookups, and the supply lines running to them were buried but not particularly deep, because the contractor who installed them had cut costs and buried them at only about 18 inches instead of the standard 36 inches below the frost line in our climate zone. I knew this because I had overheard Joan bragging about how she had saved the HOA $3,000 on that project by negotiating the contractor down, without understanding, apparently, that the contractor had made up his margin by doing the job wrong. Those shallow supply lines were totally exposed on the north side to the exact same wind corridor that my tarp was blocking. And I knew for a fact that the only reason those lines had not frozen solid in the past 2 winters was because my tarp had been deflecting the worst of the north wind away from that section of fence line. I had not installed my tarp to protect HOA infrastructure. I had installed it to protect my own pipes. But the geometry of the situation meant it was doing double duty, and I had never mentioned this to anyone because honestly it had not seemed important. Until now. I went inside, got a cup of coffee, and called my friend Marcus Webb, who is a licensed plumber with 22 years of experience and who has done work on several houses in Maplewood Ridge, including mine. I described the situation to him, specifically asking him about the risk to shallow buried supply lines in the kind of temperatures we were looking at in the next 10 days, and Marcus was not ambiguous. He said, and I wrote this down because I had a feeling I might need it later, that any supply line buried at less than 30 inches in our climate zone was at significant risk of freezing in sustained temperatures below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and that with the wind chill values being forecast, the effective frost penetration would be substantially accelerated. He said if someone had lines at 18 inches with nothing to break the wind on the exposed side, they were probably going to have a problem inside of 48 hours after temperatures dropped to that range. I thanked Marcus and told him I would be in touch. I had a feeling he was right. That afternoon, I drove over to the hardware store and bought the supplies I needed to properly winterize my own north side pipes using an alternative method, which involved foam pipe insulation wrap, heat tape connected to an outdoor-rated timer, and a secondary layer of rigid foam board insulation that I could mount directly against the foundation wall. This would protect my pipes just as effectively as the tarp, just in a way that was entirely invisible and entirely within the HOA's guidelines, since foundation insulation boards were not covered by any provision in the aesthetic guidelines. I also stopped by the hardware store's copy center and printed out Marcus's contact information, the weather forecast for the next 2 weeks, and a couple of articles about frost line depths and pipe freezing that I had found through a quick internet search. I came home, got to work, and had my own pipes protected by about 4 in the afternoon. Then I removed the tarp. I did it properly and thoroughly. I unhooked every bungee cord, pulled every stake out of the frozen ground, folded the tarp neatly, and put it in my garage. The north fence line was now completely open. The field beyond it stretched out flat and gray toward the horizon, and you could already feel the wind picking up as the front that the forecasters had been talking about began to make its presence known. The temperature had been dropping steadily all day, and by the time I finished it was down to 14 degrees with a wind out of the northwest that made it feel closer to 0. I stood there for a moment looking at the now exposed section of HOA fence line and the utility corridor beyond it, and I felt a very specific mixture of feelings that I am not entirely proud of, but that I also will not pretend I did not feel. Then I went inside, made dinner, and watched the weather report, which was now showing forecast lows of -8 for Thursday night and a wind advisory through the weekend. I did take one other precaution that evening. I dug out my outdoor security camera system and installed an additional wide-angle camera on the back corner of my house that gave me a clear view of the fence line and the utility corridor beyond. I did this not because I was planning anything, but because I had learned from experience that when you are in a dispute with someone like Joan Bishop, having documented evidence of exactly what you did, and when you did it, is worth more than any argument you could make with words. I set the camera to continuous recording with timestamp overlay and went to bed. Tuesday was cold, genuinely biting cold, the kind of cold that makes your car hesitant to start and turns every puddle of water in the neighborhood into a skating rink by 8 in the morning. I was out early shoveling my driveway, which had gotten about 3 inches of fresh snow overnight, and I noticed that Joan Bishop's silver Buick had actually slid partway down her driveway when she backed out and had bumped gently into the snowbank at the bottom. She was in the car, clearly angry, rocking it back and forth, and I waved cheerfully when she finally got traction and pulled out. She did not wave back. My neighbor on the east side, a guy named Steve Park who had lived here about 4 years and who I generally got along with well, came out to shovel his own driveway around the same time, and we ended up chatting briefly over the fence. Steve asked what was going on with my tarp being gone, because he had noticed it was missing and was curious. I told him the short version, which was that Joan had written me up and I had complied. Steve made a face and said something about how it had been a rough winter already and the last thing people needed was more hassle from the HOA. I agreed, and we went back to our respective driveways. Wednesday, the temperature fell further. By the afternoon, it was down to 3 degrees with a wind chill of -17, and the Weather Service had issued a winter storm warning for Thursday into Friday, with additional snowfall of 6 to 10 inches expected on top of the bitter cold. I checked my own pipes from inside and everything was fine. The heat tape was working perfectly, the insulation was doing its job, and my house was warm and tight. I also checked my security camera footage from the past 24 hours, and it showed, very clearly, the exposed fence line and the open HOA utility corridor being absolutely blasted by wind coming in from the north. The tarp was definitely gone. You could see the snow and debris blowing against the fence line with nothing to stop it. Thursday morning, I woke up to -4 on the thermometer and a missed call from Dave Greer, who lived on the other side of the utility corridor from my north fence. I called him back. He was upset. He had gone out to check on something in the HOA's utility corridor because he had seen what he described as some kind of water thing happening, and had found that one of the supply lines to the guest hookups had clearly frozen and then burst. There was ice everywhere along that section. He had taken pictures. He was calling everyone he could think of to report it. I listened carefully, asked a few questions, and then told Dave that I would call the HOA's emergency maintenance line. He thought that was a good idea. I called the emergency line, got Joan Bishop's voicemail, which was annoying but not surprising, and left a detailed message explaining that there appeared to be a pipe failure in the HOA utility corridor on the north side of the Maplewood Ridge fence line, adjacent to properties on Crestwood Lane, that the issue appeared to be a freezing-related burst, and that it would require immediate attention to prevent further water damage and ice accumulation on the public areas nearby. I left my name and callback number. Joan called me back 47 minutes later, and she was already in a fully defensive posture before she even knew what I was going to say. The conversation went something like this. She said she had received my message and that the HOA's maintenance contractor would be assessing the situation, and then before I could respond, she said something that made me actually have to set the phone down for a second to keep from laughing. She said, and I am paraphrasing only slightly, that the pipe issue was the result of unusual weather conditions, and that the HOA would not be accepting responsibility for any contributory factors in the area, by which she seemed to be gesturing, very awkwardly, at the fact that my tarp was no longer there. I said I was not sure what she meant. She said something about how changes in the surrounding properties could affect the microclimate of the shared corridor. I said, very pleasantly, that I had simply complied with the violation notice she had sent me. I had removed the tarp she had identified as a violation. I had done so promptly, within 48 hours of receiving the notice, and I had documentation of the date and time of removal. I also mentioned that my security camera had continuous timestamp footage of the fence line for the entire period, and that the tarp had been fully removed on Monday afternoon. There was a silence on the phone that lasted about 4 seconds, which is a very long silence in a phone conversation. Joan then said that the HOA did not believe there was any causal relationship between my tarp removal and the utility line failure. I said that was interesting, and that I had spoken with a licensed plumber who had a professional opinion on that question if she wanted to hear it, and that I also had the installation records for the utility lines which, if I recalled correctly from the community newsletter where Joan had announced the project, had been installed at a depth that was somewhat below the standard frost line for our climate zone. Another silence. She said the installation had been performed by a licensed contractor. I said I was sure it had, but that licensing did not always prevent cutting corners on depth, and that if the lines had been installed to the proper depth, they would likely have been more resistant to the temperatures we were experiencing. I also said this very gently, without any heat in my voice, because I was not trying to get into an argument with Joan. I was simply laying out facts. She said she would have the board look into the matter and that I should expect a follow-up communication. I said that sounded great and that I was happy to cooperate fully. I also mentioned, as if it had just occurred to me, that since I had complied with the violation notice, I assumed the violation had been resolved and I would not be receiving any further fines. She confirmed, somewhat stiffly, that that was correct. I thanked her and hung up. The next thing I did was call Marcus Webb back and tell him the situation had developed exactly as he had predicted. He was not surprised. He said he would be happy to provide a written professional assessment of the frost line issue if that would be useful, and I told him I would very much appreciate that and would let him know if it got to a point where we needed it formally documented. Then I called Dave Greer back and told him what Joan had said. Dave was not pleased. He said that the burst pipe had actually flooded a portion of the pathway that connected the guest parking area to the main common area walk, and that it had frozen solid overnight, and that there was now a sheet of ice about 40 feet long right in a spot where people regularly walked their dogs and kids cut through on the way to the small community mailbox cluster. He said he had already seen 2 people slip on it that morning, both of whom had caught themselves but who could easily have been hurt. He said he was going to bring it up at the next HOA meeting. I told him that sounded like a very reasonable plan, and that if he wanted any supporting information, I was happy to share what I had documented. By Thursday afternoon, word had spread through the neighborhood the way it always does when something happens in winter that is simultaneously inconvenient and a little bit absurd. My neighbor Linda Horton, who you will remember from the handicap ramp saga, texted me asking if it was true that the HOA had forced me to take down my windbreak and the pipes had frozen. I told her the short version, and she responded with a series of emoji that I think were meant to convey both sympathy and a very specific kind of satisfaction that people feel when a bully gets a small taste of consequence. Steve Park came by again that afternoon, this time not to shovel, but just to talk. He stood at my back fence and looked at the exposed utility corridor and shook his head slowly. He had spoken to Dave, and he understood the situation pretty well. He asked me if I thought the HOA was going to try to pin this on me somehow, which I thought was a pretty perceptive question. I said I thought they might try, but that I had a fairly strong position because I had done exactly what they told me to do, and I had the documentation to prove it. He said that was smart, and then he said something that I thought was interesting, which was that he had been keeping his own notes on Joan Bishop's selective enforcement for about 2 years, ever since she had given him a violation letter for a flag he was flying that was technically larger than the guideline permitted, but that she had apparently decided to enforce specifically, because it was a military service flag, and she had some personal opinion about it being political. He had actually contacted a lawyer about that one, and Joan had backed down very quickly when the lawyer sent a letter pointing out some things about flag display regulations that the HOA guidelines could not legally override. I said that was very interesting and that maybe we should compare notes at some point. He said absolutely. Friday brought the storm. 6 inches of new snow fell overnight into Friday morning, and the temperatures stayed brutal, and the ice sheet from the burst pipe in the utility corridor got covered with snow, which made it actually more dangerous because you could not see it anymore. There were at least 3 people who reported slipping in the area over the course of Friday, one of whom was a woman named Greta Holland who was in her mid-70s and who very nearly fell badly. Her husband Gerald, who was not a small man and who had served 2 terms on the HOA board before Joan had essentially maneuvered him off through a series of rule changes that conveniently invalidated his committee appointments, was now extremely unhappy and was saying things at a volume that could be heard from his front driveway about 4 houses down. Gerald Holland called me that afternoon. He had my number from the time I had helped him install a generator transfer switch the previous winter, and he wanted to know the full story. I told him everything, from the violation letter to the tarp removal to my conversation with Joan and everything in between. I also mentioned the questions I had raised about the reserve fund at the previous HOA meeting and the written request I had submitted for financial records that had never been fulfilled. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and I remember this clearly, that Joan Bishop had been stonewalling financial record requests from 3 different homeowners, not just me, and that there was some concern, which he would not characterize as more than a suspicion, that the money that had disappeared from the reserve fund had not been spent on legitimate administrative or consultation costs, but might have gone somewhere it should not have. I said that was a serious thing to say. He said he knew that. He said he was not throwing the word fraud around lightly, but that he thought it was worth someone taking a closer look, and that the combination of the reserve fund issue and the current situation with the frozen pipes and the hazardous ice sheet might be enough to get more people in the neighborhood engaged enough to actually push for a proper accounting. I said I thought he was right, and I told him about my financial records request and the lack of response. He said he would coordinate with a couple of other homeowners who had also submitted requests and see if they could make a joint formal demand. He also mentioned that if the HOA continued to ignore the hazardous ice sheet, there was a question of liability for any injuries that occurred on common property, which was something the HOA's insurance carrier might be very interested to hear about. The weekend was a busy one. The snow continued to accumulate, the temperatures stayed in the single digits, and the ice sheet in the common area got progressively worse. On Saturday morning, someone spray-painted a rough warning on a piece of cardboard and stuck it in the snow near the hazard, because the HOA had done nothing official to mark or address it. The cardboard said "Danger Ice" in orange spray paint, and it was not elegant, but it probably prevented several more people from falling. Joan Bishop drove past the cardboard sign on Saturday, and rather than dealing with the actual ice or putting up proper caution markers, sent a text to the neighborhood message board saying that the unauthorized signage was a violation of the Maplewood Ridge Community Communication Standards and should be removed. This was possibly the single most tone-deaf thing she could have done in the circumstances, and the response she got from the neighborhood message board was comprehensive and not complimentary. Even people who had never had a problem with the HOA were commenting that maybe the priority should be the ice first and the sign enforcement second. Gerald Holland wrote a response that was 3 paragraphs long and extremely pointed. Steve Park posted the photo Dave had taken of the burst pipe. Linda Horton wrote something that was not profane, but that was the written equivalent of throwing down a gauntlet. Joan's response was to claim that the situation was under management and that professional contractors had been engaged, which was news to everyone because no contractor had appeared at any point. Sunday morning, I got a call from an unfamiliar number that turned out to be a woman named Karen Shields, who identified herself as a resident on the other side of the subdivision, who I had never personally met. She said she was an attorney, specifically a real estate attorney who handled HOA law among other things, and that she had been watching the neighborhood message board conversation with considerable professional interest. She said she was not offering legal services in an official capacity, but as a neighbor, she wanted to share some information that might be useful. She told me that the HOA was legally required to provide financial records to any homeowner who made a written request within 30 days of the request, per our state's condominium and HOA statute. She said if that request had been outstanding for more than 30 days without a response or a formal denial with stated reasons, that was a violation of state law, not just an HOA policy issue. She also said that if someone had been misusing reserve funds, that could constitute fraud, and that the board members who were aware of it and had not acted, not just the person who had done it, could potentially be exposed to civil liability. She said she thought a group of residents making a coordinated formal request, followed quickly by a complaint to the state's HOA oversight body if the request was not fulfilled, would probably get Joan's attention pretty quickly. She said she was willing to help draft the formal request letter as a neighbor, not as a retained attorney, if people wanted it worded in a way that was maximally effective. I told her that I thought that would be enormously appreciated and asked if I could share her name with Gerald and Steve and the others. She said yes. Within 24 hours, we had a group of 11 homeowners who had collectively signed onto a joint formal request for financial records from the HOA, drafted by Aaron Shields, and citing the specific state statutes, and giving the HOA a 10-day window to respond, after which the group would file a complaint with the state REAL, a state regulatory office. The letter was delivered to Joan Bishop by certified mail on Monday, 6 days after she had sent me that initial violation notice, and according to the delivery tracking, it was signed for at 2:14 in the afternoon. The contractor finally appeared to deal with the burst pipe and the ice sheet on Monday as well, which was 3 days after the pipe had failed, and the repairs to the supply line took most of the day. The ice sheet had to be treated with salt and carefully broken up and removed by hand because the frozen ground underneath had been compromised. The contractor, a crew from a company called Meridian Property Services, was not shy about mentioning that the pipe had been at an inadequate depth and that whoever had installed it had not done it correctly for the climate zone. One of the crew members said this loud enough that Dave Greer, who was standing nearby watching, made sure to get the man's name for his notes. Joan did not appear at any point during the repairs. She sent a brief text to the neighborhood board saying that the issue had been resolved by professional contractors and that normal operations had been restored. Gerald Holland replied on the message board publicly that the issue had taken 72 hours to address, during which time multiple residents had been exposed to a slip-and-fall hazard on common property, and that Greta Holland, his wife, had nearly fallen, and that he was consulting with an attorney about the association's liability for failing to address a known hazard promptly. He added that the formal records request had been submitted and that residents should expect updates. The 10-day deadline passed without a response from Joan or anyone else on the HOA board. Aaron Shields filed the complaint with the state REAL, a state regulatory office, on day 11, and the 11 signatory homeowners each also filed individual complaints citing the non-response. What happened next unfolded over about 3 weeks, and I will summarize it because the details got dense, but the essentials are these. The state regulatory office conducted an initial review and determined there was sufficient basis to launch a formal inquiry. They sent an inspector to examine the HOA's financial records, and what the inspector found was not good for Joan Bishop. Over a period of approximately 22 months, just under $42,000 had been moved out of the HOA's reserve fund in a series of transfers to an account that was ostensibly for administrative and consulting services. When the inspector requested documentation of what those services were and who had provided them. The documentation that Joan provided was incomplete, inconsistent, and in 2 cases referenced vendors whose business registrations could not be verified because they were not actually registered businesses. 2 of the payments appeared to be to entities that, when traced, led back to Joan Bishop's own family members. The inspector referred the matter to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, and from there it escalated to a criminal investigation. I am not a lawyer, and I will not pretend to fully understand every step of what happened legally, but the end result was that Joan Bishop was charged with embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty in connection with the misappropriation of HOA funds. She was arrested on a Wednesday afternoon in early February, which I happened to see from my home office window because a police car pulled up in front of her house and 2 officers went to the door. The neighborhood was, predictably, paying close attention. Gerald Holland texted me the moment it happened. His message said simply, "Well, there it is." Joan was released on bond but was immediately required to surrender all of her HOA credentials and access. The full HOA board, all 3 members, were notified by the regulatory office that they had a legal obligation to cooperate with the investigation and to take interim governance measures, and they did so with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for an excuse to get out from under Joan's shadow. An emergency homeowners meeting was called within a week. The board appointed an interim compliance coordinator who happened to be Frank Gallo, the reasonable retired teacher who Joan had pushed out 3 years ago, and a forensic accounting firm was hired to do a full audit of the HOA's finances for the past 3 years. The audit took about 5 weeks and confirmed the $42,000 in questionable transfers. The recovery process was going to be complicated and lengthy, but the association's insurance carrier, once presented with the documentation, opened a fidelity claim that looked like it would cover most of the misappropriated funds. In the meantime, the HOA under Frank Gallo's interim coordination went through its existing list of open violation notices and did something that Joan had apparently never done, which was evaluate each one for whether it was actually reasonable and enforceable. The vast majority were dropped. Mine was already resolved, of course, since I had removed the tarp and complied, but Frank sent me a personal note saying that given the circumstances the board was issuing a formal statement acknowledging that my tarp had served a legitimate protective function, and that the enforcement of the violation had been inappropriate, and that the board would be revising the guidelines to include a clear variance process for functional weather protection measures that were not visible from the street. I thanked Frank. He was a good guy, and I had always thought so. Gerald Holland did end up consulting with an attorney about Greta's near fall, and while no formal lawsuit was filed, the HOA's insurance carrier paid a small settlement to cover her medical checkup costs and acknowledged that the delay in addressing the ice hazard had been unreasonable. Gerald used the opportunity to push for a formal policy requiring that common area hazards be addressed within 24 hours of being reported, with a backup contractor on call for exactly these kinds of winter emergencies. The board adopted the policy unanimously at the next regular meeting. Steve Park got an apology letter from the HOA about the flag violation. It was brief, but it was in writing, and it acknowledged that the enforcement had been improper. He framed it and put it on his wall, which I thought was entirely appropriate. Linda Horton cried a little at the homeowners' meeting when Frank Gallo announced the rule changes, and I do not think anyone blamed her. She had been through a lot of unnecessary frustration, and having it acknowledged publicly, even in a modest way, clearly meant something to her. Marcus Webb, my plumber friend, submitted his formal written assessment of the frost line issue and the improper depth of the HOA's utility line installation to the board, and that documentation became part of the contractor accountability process. Meridian Property Services, who had done the repair, confirmed what their crew had said on site, that the original installation had been substandard. The board identified the original contractor and sent a demand letter for the cost of the burst pipe repair, citing the inadequate burial depth. That dispute was ongoing, but the board was pursuing it. As for me, I put the tarp back up. Frank had fast-tracked the new variance process, and I had my approval in hand before the next cold front hit. I also updated the tarp to a slightly better one, dark green instead of blue, which honestly looked more natural against the fence line anyway. I reinstalled it one morning in mid-February when the temperature had climbed back up to about 25 degrees, which felt practically balmy after what we had been through, and I took my time doing it right, staking it properly and making sure it was tight and secure. As I was finishing up, Dave Greer appeared on the other side of the fence. He was holding 2 mugs of coffee, and he handed one to me through the fence gap. We stood there in the cold for a few minutes, sipping coffee and looking at the flat gray field to the north. He said, "Funny how that works." I said, "What's that?" He said, "She wrote you up for a tarp and it ended her." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said that I did not think it had been the tarp exactly. I thought it had been the assumption that she could use the rules as a weapon without anyone pushing back, and the moment that assumption was tested, it started pulling on a thread that unraveled a lot of other things she had been doing. The tarp was just the occasion. Dave considered this and then nodded. He said, "Either way, I'm glad the pipes froze." I looked at him. He grinned. "Not my pipes, her pipes." I laughed. I could not help it. And I told him that I was, in a narrow and not entirely charitable sense, glad about it too. We finished our coffee. The wind was picking up from the north again, the way it always did in February, coming in cold and clean across that flat field. But this time I had my tarp in place, properly approved, blocking the worst of it. My pipes were fine. The HOA's pipes were repaired, finally, and buried at the right depth this time because Frank had made sure the repair was done to code. The ice sheet was long gone. The spray-painted cardboard sign was gone too, replaced by a proper community notice board that someone had donated and installed near the guest parking area. The neighborhood felt, genuinely, like a different place than it had even a month earlier. Not because anything dramatic had changed in terms of the physical landscape, but because the dynamic had shifted. The person who had made everyone's lives quietly miserable with arbitrary enforcement and petty power trips was gone, and the person who had replaced her actually talked to people and listened and applied judgment, instead of just looking for violations to rack up. Frank had already been out twice just walking the streets and saying hello to people, which Joan had never once done in 3 years except when she was handing someone a violation notice. The community message board, which had been mostly a place where people posted terse warnings about parking disputes and Joan's announcements, was now being used for actual neighbor stuff. People offering to help each other with snow removal, someone looking for a pet sitter, someone else asking if anyone had a good recommendation for a gutter contractor. Small things, but the right kind of small things. The criminal case against Joan moved through the system over the following months. She ultimately pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of fraudulent misappropriation of organizational funds and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, required to make full restitution of the $42,000, and permanently barred from serving on any homeowners association board in the state. Her attorney argued that the restitution amount was burdensome, and the judge was not sympathetic. She paid it in installments over 18 months, and the HOA's reserve fund was eventually restored to a healthy balance. The new HOA board, elected properly at the annual spring meeting, included Gerald Holland as vice president, Karen Shields as the legal advisor, and a young woman named Tanya Osai who had just moved in the previous year and who had about as much patience for nonsense as any of us. Frank Gallo stayed on as compliance coordinator in an official capacity, And the first thing the new board did was revise the entire guidelines document from top to bottom, streamlining it, clarifying the variance process, and adding an explicit provision that enforcement actions had to be applied consistently across all properties, and that any homeowner could request a review of an enforcement decision by a committee that included at least one non-board member resident. They also added a specific provision that functional weather protection measures, including windbreaks, pipe insulation, and similar items installed on non-street-facing property lines, were permitted with a simple notification to the board rather than requiring a full variance application. The provision was called, in the guidelines document, the weather utility exception. Gerald Holland had suggested the name. I had not asked him to. One evening in late March, after the last of the snow had finally melted and the neighborhood looked like itself again, muddy and tired but unmistakably moving towards spring, I was sitting on my front porch with a beer enjoying the first genuinely warm evening of the year when Steve Park walked by with his dog. He stopped at my porch steps and we talked for a while, the comfortable way neighbors talk when they have been through something together and come out the other side of it. He said he had been thinking about what had happened, and that it was a good reminder that these kinds of associations only work as well as the people running them, and that the solution to a bad actor in a position like that was not to get rid of HOAs entirely, which some people were calling for on the message board, but to be engaged enough as a community to hold them accountable. He said the problem had been not that the rules existed, but that only one person was paying attention to them, and that one person had been using that asymmetry to her advantage. I said I thought that was right. I said that what had gotten us here was actually pretty simple. It was a group of neighbors who had each been dealing with Joan individually, feeling kind of isolated about it. And then a situation came along that was tangible and visible enough that people felt comfortable saying out loud what they had all been thinking quietly. The pipes were like a physical, concrete manifestation of what happens when someone in authority makes decisions for reasons that have nothing to do with the community's actual well-being. Steve nodded. His dog sat down next to him and put her chin on his knee. He said, "Also, it's funny. You have to admit it's funny." I said it absolutely was. A woman tries to use an HOA rule to harass a neighbor she does not like, and the consequence is that the infrastructure she was responsible for freezes solid in 48 hours, because the thing she made him remove was the only thing keeping it intact. If you wrote that in a story, someone would say it was too neat and too convenient, but that was actually what had happened. He laughed. His dog looked up at him, confused by the sound. I said that honestly the thing I kept coming back to was how simple Joan's mistake had been. She had looked at my tarp and seen only what she wanted to see, which was an excuse to write me up and make my life difficult. She had not bothered to think about what the tarp was actually doing, or why it was there, or what removing it would mean. She had treated the rule as a tool for one specific purpose, and had not thought about anything else. And that single lack of curiosity, that complete absence of actual consideration, was what had done her in. If she had just called me and asked about the tarp, I would have explained it, and maybe we could have worked something out, and none of the rest of it would have happened the way it did. Or maybe it would have eventually anyway, given the reserve fund situation, but not like this, not with such clean and immediate consequences. Steve said he thought that was the best way to describe it. He said Joan had been so focused on wielding the rules that she had never learned what the rules were actually for. I said yeah, that was about it. We sat with that for a moment. The evening air was still cool but had that particular quality that early spring evenings get after a hard winter, a softness that feels earned rather than just seasonal. Down the street I could see Gerald Holland out with his wife Greta, walking their usual evening route, and they were moving slowly, the way people do when the pavement has been icy for months, and the habit of caution has not quite worn off yet. Gerald raised his hand when he saw me on the porch and I raised my beer. Everything was, at least for this neighborhood in this subdivision at the end of this particular winter, genuinely okay. My tarp was back up. My pipes were warm and intact behind their foam insulation and heat tape. The HOA's supply lines were properly buried this time, down at the code-compliant depth, and the repairs had been done right. Joan Bishop was paying back $42,000 one monthly installment at a time, and she would never serve on another HOA board in this state for the rest of her life. Frank Gallo was walking the streets and waving hello to his neighbors, and the new board was already talking about using some of the recovered reserve funds to finally do the resurfacing on the community path that had been delayed for 2 years. And somewhere to the north, that big flat field was sitting quietly under the last remnants of winter, already starting to give way to mud at the edges, the frost retreating down into the ground the way it always does eventually, no matter how hard the winter has been. I finished my beer, went inside, checked my security camera feed out of habit, saw nothing but the fence line and the open field and the tarp doing its job quietly in the mild evening breeze, and went to bed. Winter was over,